Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today we're going to be talking resilience with Ben Ashdown and Dr. Mustafa Sarkar. Ben, Mus, welcome.
Hi Dan.
Hi Ben, thanks for the invite.
Yeah, great to have you back, Mus. I think this is your fifth time on. Record breaker. I think you've been on more than anybody else. And Ben, it's great to meet you. I'm looking forward to unpacking a paper you've co-authored alongside other great sports psychs on resilience. But Ben, welcome. Your first time on the show. Give us a bit of a biography. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, it's an honour to be on the show. I'm a big fan of it, and I know from the calibre of guests you've had on previously, it's a real honour to be talking today. So, in terms of myself, I'm a senior lecturer at Nottingham Trent University. So I lead on the sport and exercise psychology modules over at a campus in Mansfield. So we've got a satellite site over there, and my route to this point, I wouldn't say it's not been non-traditional, but it's taken some different turns. So kind of going through school education, A levels into university, always kind of felt that essentially I wanted to be a PE teacher like a lot of young people, and didn't really know what direction I was going to go in. And it was a conversation with Dr. Lee Crust, actually, in the third year. He supervised my dissertation. He said, we've got a master's program running here, which I think you'd be suited to. It was a sports psychology master's, and to be honest, I didn't really know what a master's was at that time. So having played cricket to a decent level, I wanted to go out to Australia and play and coach out there. So I did that for a couple of years post uni, and then went on to the masters. And it was a small program. There was 5 or 6 of us. It was led at that stage by Andrew Hill and Howard Hall, so there was a lot of perfectionism content in there, which was really, really interesting. I could relate to a lot of that stuff. And then after that, I'd kind of got to a stage where I kind of wanted to go in a different direction. I wanted to essentially really sort of go into teaching or research. Some of the people that are on the masters, there's some really good academics in there. So Sarah Mallinson, Howard, and Gareth Jowett, both there. They're academics now in lecturing roles, and Liam Slack, who's now working for the PGMOL and the match officials there. So they all kind of went straight into PhDs. I then went into a research role initially for a year, and then there was an opportunity to go into a teaching role in a further education setting, which I took, and ended up being in that for 10 years. For anyone that's worked in the further education domain, so primarily it was teaching 16 to 18-year-olds, but we also delivered a degree. So I eventually coordinated the degree program in sports science there. But, it's quite a demanding setting. You're teaching a lot of hours. There was no real room for research. I always wanted to do a PhD at some stage, but was lucky enough then to move to NTU, and very quickly got onto a doctoral program. And I'm 4 years into a part-time PhD alongside full-time sort of teaching role. So I've also done a few bits of kind of grassroots football coaching, and that is where the idea or the inspiration for this research initially came from. I was observing a lot of behaviours in my players, which I was really interested in, particularly when things weren't going well. I was seeing certain things and I was wondering what was going on there. So it was almost a chance email really to Muzz and others, and I sort of tried to sell this idea, and Muzz was fantastic in terms of getting straight back to me, and we had loads of chats, and now we're working together on this and other projects. So hopefully that was not too long an introduction.
No, really good insights into your background there, a cricket playing and coaching background, academia teaching, and grassroots soccer coaching. So a real mix there that I'm sure influences your research today. Coming over to you, Muzz, as I said earlier, I think this is the 5th time that you've been on the Sports Psych Show. Always an honour and delight to have you on. For the 5th time, sir, tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Yeah, sure. Mustafa Sarkar. I'm associate professor in sport and performance psychology at Nottingham Trent. Broadly um, interested in the psychology of performance excellence in sport, but also in other performance domains. So we've started to do some work, for example, in the police as well. And yeah, probably three main areas of work. Resilience being probably the one most kind of prominent. Individual resilience, team resilience, and also organizational resilience. Um, Also started to do some work in the area of psychological safety, and also some work in relation to kind of mental health as well. Um, and I guess something that I've been very, very passionate about, Dan, which I'm sure you're aware of, is that I've always been probably an academic at heart, but I've always wanted to do research that can have an impact in practice, and that's really been my kind of main philosophy. And I think Ben's work is really at the heart of that kind of philosophy of doing work that can have an impact on the ground in coaching with sports science kind of practitioners on the ground. Um, and yeah, looking forward to seeing how Ben's work can kind of deliver on that aspect for sure.
Well, as you've mentioned there, your passion for engaging with practical research, I suppose, or pragmatic research that we could describe it as, research that people like myself as a consultant can go out and utilize, I think it's so powerful, it's so useful. And we're here today to talk about this piece of research led by you, Ben, as you've said, and supported by yourself, Muz, but also Chris Sorwood and Julie Johnston. And Julie's been on the Sports Psych show previously. This piece of research around resilience is entitled Exploring the Behavioural Indicators of Resilience in Professional Academy Youth Soccer. And it's at the level of behaviour, I think is so much interest to me. As much as I'm greedy and hungry for information on the thoughts, emotions and feelings that people experience and how they impact behaviour. Of course, just examining behaviour at that surface level is such a powerful thing to do for all of us involved in sport. Coming back to you first, Muz, talk to me a little bit about, I mean, Ben said he approached you with regard ideas around resilience and behaviour. I'm sure. Can you unpack that for us a little bit? The genesis of this research.
Yeah, and it was a kind of a joint conversation based on, I guess, Ben's kind of personal observations as a grassroots coach, but also from a resilience research point of view. Up until Ben's work, most of it had focused on self-report. So it was either interviews or questionnaires. So with interviews, we've done a lot of work looking at kind of perceptions and experiences, as you mentioned there, Dan, kind of thoughts, emotions and feelings. And obviously, with questionnaires, we're looking to assess and measure someone's resilience. But ultimately, both interviews and questionnaires are very much self-report. And what we noticed in terms of a gap was the fact that in terms of the resilience research, there had been very little on, I don't know whether or not you want to call it more objective, but kind of certainly more tangible things that you might see on the ground, these kind of observable behaviors, which from a research point of view, we didn't know really much about at all. So it was trying to make sure that we got kind of a greater breadth of data beyond what we've previously known around some of that self-report information. I guess the second aspect of it was specifically in the context of youth soccer or youth football, because from our kind of experiences, particularly in academy football, we were noticing that resilience was a word that was being used a lot within academies. So much so that it was part of philosophies, it was part of kind of words that were visions and values of clubs, specifically around resilience. And when you then spoke to coaches, sports psychologists, even staff, other kind of staff, sports science kind of practitioners on the ground, they'd always say, we want our players to be resilient. But actually, when you unpack that a little bit further, there wasn't really a clear understanding around what specifically they wanted or what specifically they meant by that. So I think the other part of it was looking at resilience behaviors in the kind of the youth academy context, because I think, yeah, resilience was a term that was being used a lot without kind of concrete actions or behaviors that coaches, practitioners could actually look out for. Ben, I don't know if there's anything else to add in relation to that.
No, I think you summarised it nicely. Other than this might be some sort of confirmation bias for myself, but when you read around football reporting, particularly in the recent Euros, this thing of, this player demonstrated resilience or this team was resilient. Gareth Southgate seemed to mention that quite a lot in his interviews. So it does seem to be an important topical issue in football. And yeah, hopefully this research has gone some way to exploring that a bit further and giving a little bit more context or depth to what these behaviours actually might look like.
Just dwelling on this for a few seconds and maybe coming back to you, Muz. I mean, is listening to what you're saying, I'm hearing you say, well, resilience has become a bit of a buzzword, and in part that word is up in lights because of your research. There's research globally on this, but you've done a lot of great research on this in the past and pushed this through in sporting governing bodies and the importance of it, and clubs and organisations are starting to, in essence, put the posters up about resilience, and as you said, they become a part of their values. But what I'm kind of hearing you say, Mers, is like, yeah, that's great and that's fantastic and it's all very well, but we need to define what this looks like and maybe also define what coaches need to do in order to develop this. I mean, just pausing there, that's kind of what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, I think we've definitely made some strides in relation to kind of academic and practical definitions. We've done a piece of work actually looking at some of the myths and misconceptions around resilience that we've published in Amy and Jen's book around myths of sports coaching. So I think we're definitely making strides around what resilience is, what resilience is not. I think the step within Ben's work was to I guess translate that in relation to specific behaviors or observable indicators that coaches and practitioners could actually see on the pitch. We did have a discussion with Ben around, do we just look at on pitch? Do we look at off pitch? And there was an interesting discussion and conversation. For the purposes of this PhD, we are just looking specifically at on pitch behaviors. But I think, yeah, it's translating what we know around what resilience is to actually tangible actions, so that coaches and practitioners are on the same wavelength. I think that for me is the crucial bit, that they're on the same wavelength, that when they're seeing a behavior on the pitch, that can give them an indication as to whether or not that is someone who is demonstrating either higher or lower levels of resilience.
Coming over to you, Ben, before we unpack this paper, just backing up and maybe in tune with what Muz was saying there. When you were a grassroots coach, and you probably still are, but when you've been coaching, what have you seen? What were you seeing that made you think, hang on a minute, we need to look at this in more depth. We need to explore this and start being able to change this?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. What I did observe and what I did see was certain individual differences between players in the team I coached anyway. So in response to these stresses or these adversities, if you want to use that term, I coached a team that didn't have much success. Hopefully that wasn't anything to do with my coaching, but we lost a lot of games. We went behind a lot. And I would notice certain individuals, their body language changed. They sometimes stopped kind of showing for the ball. They stopped blaming each other. They put in less effort at certain points. And at this stage, I didn't sort of necessarily think this was due to this thing called resilience at that stage, but I certainly made me reflect as a coach, and particularly in terms of, is there anything that I can do to develop those behavioural responses when these pressures or stresses occur? And I think just to come back to Muz's point there, and I am jumping ahead slightly here to further research we've done. In this study, we talked to essentially football experts. So that common language around resilience, arguably that changed between academies. So we were quite clear on having, like a definition that we provided to them. So we were talking about the same thing essentially. In future studies, what we've done next, actually, we've spoken to resilience experts and people with expertise in kind of sports psychology practice as well. So we're getting that different perspective. But yeah, I think that's a really important point, a possible limitation of, are we actually talking about the same thing, and therefore are we assessing the same thing?
So Ben, unpack this paper for us. We'll go through the results. I think we'll take a deep dive into the results and unpack that in granular detail. But as I said, the title is Exploring the Behavioural Indicators of Resilience in Professional Academy Youth Soccer. So yeah, take us from the beginning here.
Okay, so I suppose the inspiration for this came from those early papers, so the Holt and Dunn paper, the Mills paper in 2012, that looked at these psychosocial assets or components of those academy football players who progress through the system and potentially have successful transition into senior football. These papers highlighted resilience as one of those really important characteristics. I'm a big fan of Tom Mitchell's work as well, and the stuff he's done around his 8 pillars. Again, resilience was mentioned there, and he actually identified some kind of general behavioural descriptors that we could actually look for. And then again, more recently, we've seen Robertson's developed an observational tool for these psychosocial behaviours in football. So that was a kind of general background from the research point of view. And as was touched on earlier on, I think we identified within the existing resilience literature, we've started to build a really good understanding of what resilience is and what feeds into those positive adaptations or responses to stressors. There was a lot in that literature around actually explicitly saying, coaches or practitioners should look to develop resilient behaviours, or resilience is about positive behavioural responses to stressors. But I didn't see anything in that literature where anyone actually said, well, this is what resilience looks like in terms of those behavioural outputs, or as we called them, those behavioural indicators.
Okay. And so who were you speaking with?
Yeah, the participants for this particular study, we were lucky enough to recruit quite a broad and big sample of practitioners who are working in the youth football domain. So across 6 academies. So I'm sure your listeners are aware of the category system in this country, but we're able to get 2 Cat 1 academies, 2 Category 2, and 2 Cat 3.
Oh, could you unpack that for us a little bit? Because I think there's a lot of people listening in who wouldn't be as aware as others.
Okay, so those Category 1 academies would be those potentially with the most highly resourced. They, certainly in my experience, they had more full-time staff. They had expertise across various areas. And I think they play typically in the higher tiers of the competition there. I could be wrong in saying that. The 2 academies are then similarly well staffed, but perhaps not in the same way. And then Cat 3, there were some I spoke to who had probably 4 or 5 full-time staff and fewer teams as well, operating across fewer phases. So yeah, I think the differences from my experience are kind of mainly around resourcing and staffing, really.
Okay. And take us through the results.
Okay, so from these various discussions we had, I suppose just to take a bit of a backward step in terms of how we collected the data, we had initially we did it in 2 phases. So initially we had kind of open-ended focus groups where we had discussions around what resilience is, what behavioural indicators do you associate with players you think demonstrate resilience? And then we did some kind of analysis of the findings of that, and then we went into a second phase where we first of all did some kind of member reflection. So we presented back what we discussed in the first phase, and then we asked the participants or the clubs to present some video clips. So one example where I went to the training ground at one club, we had a display screen at the front of a classroom, and they took us through various game clips of examples of these behaviours, which gave us a bit more kind of contextual detail and understanding of what these behaviours look like and what the typical stresses are. And that created or produced quite a breadth of data, which took some time to analyse. So we found there were in total 36 behaviours that came through, and 4 that were kind of labelled kind of the opposing behavioural indicators of those. So what we found, so there were in total 40 behaviours across 7 themes, and the first of those themes was something that we labelled support focused behaviours. So participants talked there about under pressure, or when adversities happen in a game, or there's been a setback, they would expect to see a player perhaps giving verbal encouragement to a teammate, or making efforts to help them, or showing those positive kind of body language type behaviours in response to someone else's mistake. So that was the support focused.
So just pausing there. So teammate support focused resilience behaviours. I think this is really. I'd love to pause on each theme and have a broader discussion here. So teammate support focused resilience behaviours. I think many people listening in wouldn't necessarily correlate resilience with teammate support, I suppose. Can you unpack this for us a little bit more broadly? What kind of things were said? What conversations were had?
Yeah, that's a fair comment, and to kind of separate this from kind of just social support behaviours, I suppose. The participants said things like, so they gave examples of typical problems that would be encountered on the field. So a player has misplaced a pass, or given the ball away in a critical area, or missed a relatively easy chance. They said that for a player to demonstrate resilience in that moment, they would anticipate that player would at least kind of engage with that teammate and potentially offer them some support or encouragement, or that might be visible through kind of non-verbal actions like the body language and things like that. Give them a bit of a clap or something of that kind of nature.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I've clocked up quite a bit of experience in British football, soccer, and I would say there's probably slightly more of a culture of digging a player out when they've made a mistake or an error. By digging a player out, I mean that's the colloquial British term for having a go at them. So it feels like what happens at the coalface is the opposite of this idea of helping others to stay resilient.
Yeah, and I think we saw in the literature as well that potentially that is one of those key protective factors in terms of maintaining resilience in the moment. I think as well, what we're very conscious of, and this has come through in subsequent studies, is we wanted to be clear that we were, assessing resilience here. So what are those positive adaptations or responses to adversities or stresses? So for that to be separated from a typical kind of social support behaviour, I think there would have to have been a stressor, or something potentially might have had to go wrong to elicit that behavioural response, or that positive behavioural response there.
Interesting.
And I think Dan as well, just to, I guess, break down this theme. So when we identified teammate support focused resilience behaviours, the 2 main categories around that was both verbal support but also non-verbal support. So I think as a coach or kind of sports science practitioners on the ground is thinking about when you are observing these things on the pitch. It's not just focusing on. I think more noticeably you might see and hear the verbal support, but I think also it's really important for coaches to also acknowledge and encourage some of that non-verbal support as well, which often might not be seen as much, basically. So I just thought I'd mention that point about the importance of both the verbal but also the non-verbal parts of it as well.
Yeah, yeah, really interesting. A second theme.
Yeah, so the next theme was these emotion-focused resilience behaviours. So
Okay.
here, the participants talked about that capacity for players to essentially regulate their emotions when they experience setbacks or the pressures come during the game. And they talked about being able to observe a player actually showing a little bit of emotional control under pressure or when a challenge comes. They said that can sometimes be seen through positive body language or some kind of emotional trigger or a reset to reinvest back into the game. Some more subtle behaviours, even things like facial expression was mentioned there. They talked about specific scenarios where, for example, a player is substituted and they look for their behavioural responses to coming off the field and what are they doing when they're watching the game having come off the pitch. And another one was this idea of can they maintain some kind of perspective in the moment. So they called it talking about showing a bit of humour or showing a bit of perspective when setbacks happen to some extent.
You've got a quote here from a sports psychologist that you interviewed, and obviously we're speaking here to emotion-focused resilience behaviours. So on the pitch, a player is going to experience emotion, is going to experience a sense of emotion as a consequence of what's going on around them or something that they're doing. And this sports psychologist has said, quite pertinently, I think, it doesn't have to be positive immediately. There is an instinctive allowance. You could react negatively, but that has to be for a short time on the understanding that that is naturally how you feel, but then we need to click in and get on with the game. And I know in all sports remote work, I've always said that, look, we might have what might be described as a negative response to a situation we don't particularly like, but then it's that quick shift back to whether you describe it as next action or what's important now, or utilizing another tool to get back into what you might be described as the present moment to dampen down that experience of emotion.
Yeah, definitely. The participants spoke about that processing time, and then that reinvestment back in. They talk. I think, like you said there, Dan, there's inevitably they'll experience emotions, and one participant actually said that it's very likely that these behavioural responses are subject to emotional maturation or maturation in general. So potentially, this was one. When we set out to do this study, we thought, will there be any age-specific differences here? So would we expect to see, a player in the younger age groups being a bit more emotionally reactive to a player who is 18 and above? So I think in terms of the demonstration of some of these behaviours, there might be some age-related differences there as a result of, kind of emotional maturity.
And I think, Dan, as well, practically, I think the quote there that you mentioned from the sports psychologist, I think that also is interesting from the point of view of guidance that we provide to coaches and to practitioners around when they are observing things on the pitch, particularly around emotion-focused resilience behaviors, is the timing of some of this stuff. So if, for example, they do see a negative reaction straight away, but actually over a period of time, that negative reaction actually ends up being a little bit more helpful and constructive, or it changes from being negative to a little bit more positive. It's, I guess, educating coaches around actually not necessarily making a judgment straight after a mistake or when they're under pressure, but giving a little bit of time allowance potentially. So I think that's an interesting, I guess, I imagine coaches' comeback will be about, we have to observe or we have to make a judgment quite quickly, and I definitely appreciate that. But I think from an emotional regulation point of view, needs to be a little bit of allowance there, not just looking at your reaction straight away, but also maybe over a period of seconds or a minute or so to see how they then subsequently react.
I'm sure there's enormous overlap between every single theme, but it makes me think of the seriously important overlap between theme 1, teammate support focused resilience behaviours, and theme 2, emotion focused resilience behaviours, in as much as the importance of the promotion and the exhibition of those social support behaviours positively impact the capacity for teammates to manage emotions, to display emotion focused resilience. Those two, Ben, seem to really, really go hand in hand.
Yeah, I would go along with that. I think, again, jumping ahead slightly, in subsequent studies we've done, there has been an identification of crossover between certain themes, and in some cases maybe it's quite difficult to separate. But are you suggesting that does a player who is good at regulating under pressure, someone who's potentially more likely to recognise the need to support a teammate as well, or is that where you're going with there with you?
Yeah. As you mentioned, it can be challenging to untangle. I mean, I always try to take a viewpoint of two lenses in many respects, a reductionist lens and a holistic lens, in as much as sometimes I think it's important to zoom into the single, identifiable emotion or behavior or thought or affect or whatever. And then at other times we might want to zoom out and just go, yeah, I can't untangle that. That just so goes hand in hand. It's just a web of complexity there. But I like this breaking down of the themes, and I can, from my own experiences, I can see how these themes go hand in hand. But moving on to the next theme, effort focused resilience behaviours. Can you speak a bit to this for us, Ben?
Yeah, this is an interesting one actually, because having done some observational work myself, I would say this is probably the most observable or the easiest to see on the field. So here the participants spoke about the capacity to manage the physical challenges that naturally occur in a game. They talked about this word bravery quite a lot. I think that is another football specific term. They talked about physical bravery,
very much,
and also bravery in possession as well. So there was that element, but there's also this element of when there's been a setback in the game. So let's say a teammate is given the ball away, there are clearly visible physical efforts to support in defence. So a high intensity sprint backwards, or in the other direction to support attack. If the player themselves make a mistake, they quite quickly show a prompt physical effort response to try and get the ball back, maybe. Just kind of more generally across the game, you might see these physical efforts to overcome the challenges that occur. It doesn't necessarily mean giving the ball away, but we've spoken about when we're talking about maybe objectively assessing these things, could we map that to say GPS data, for example, would be an interesting direction. And also this thing of persistence came up as well. And Muz, I'm sure you might jump in here with this idea of persistence and resilience. But they mentioned that, yes, there will be challenges, yes, there will be setbacks, but the player continues physically to try and engage with the game.
Is persistence the same as resilience?
I would probably argue not. I guess persistence might be language that practitioners are using kind of within that kind of football kind of context. I guess for me, this idea of persistence is about maybe doing something over and over again until you get it right, or whereas actually in some cases, from a resilience point of view, I would probably talk about it more in relation to flexibility. So you might actually not go down a certain course of direction, but actually go down a slightly different direction. But that's not necessarily persistence. That's just kind of being flexible in terms of the choices that you make. So I guess the theme, or one of the sub themes around persistence through challenges, I think that's where language and terminology is really important. That this shouldn't just be about, the example that I often give is, and I often hear this in sport, is, the whole no pain, no gain, playing on whilst you're injured. That might be seen as a behavioural indicator of persistence through challenges, but I don't think that's what we should be looking at in relation to resilience. That's just my view anyway.
No, it's really interesting you saying that, because it makes me reflect on, I think it was episode 240 with Dr. Catherine Johnston and Professor Joe Bacon. We talked about the impact of language, and how that can really mediate a talent development pathway's ability to develop players, to help them learn, to help them high perform. Because the language isn't necessary, or the interpretation of language, the definitions of words aren't necessarily consistent across the board. And I was sitting there thinking, what's the difference between persistence and resilience? And you've neatly summed it up in terms of persistence. Well, yeah, it's doing something over and over again, whereas resilience has a more dynamic quality to it, doesn't it, Muz? It's more about that notion of flexing maybe onto something else. I mean, I think I'm just picking out a quote here from this theme from a coach who says, I think things that definitely sort of stand out are in terms of resilience when you see players who are maybe not having the best game, or maybe in their own eyes underperforming in that game. They continue to work hard and try and push themselves to at least affect the game in a certain way. So they almost get to a point where you think they know they're not having the best of games, but they're going to try and do the best for themselves or the team, to try and have as best of an impact as they can. And this resonates with me, because I talk to players at the coalface a lot about, maybe as an objective, yes, you might strive to have your best game, but you're also going to strive to have your best possible game. And there feels like a dual role here for persistence and resilience, in terms of sometimes, and maybe this is where game intelligence comes in. If you're intelligent enough, you know when to persist, or if you're intelligent enough, you know when to be resilient and maybe flex away from the behaviours that you're engaging. No question, guys, just a sort of a thought experiment there with this theme.
Yeah, and perhaps just to add to that, recognising, and this probably crosses into the learning focused theme. So recognising when if there's a need to change, when to adapt, when to be flexible.
We'll come on to that. Next theme is robust resilience behaviours. Ben, talk us through being robust.
Okay, so this is where, the robust and rebound is kind of where it suppose ties into the existing theoretical literature around resilience. So what the participants spoke about here was these almost like performance behaviours, where a player could observably maintain some sort of functioning or normal performance under pressure, or when these stresses are happening. So this is quite a football specific one, but showing bravery. So a player, regardless of maybe a prior mistake, that will continue to try and receive the ball under pressure, and that isn't blindly continuing to so they gave examples of a player might try a forward pass, it's intercepted. The participants said we'd then look for that same player to get back on the ball and attempt the same pass. They would have a problem though if they kept trying it and kept making mistakes. So there has to be some, like we said before, some learning and adaptation. So wanting the ball, one participant spoke about, we're in a development context, so we want to see players attempting challenging skills under pressure. We want them to take some risks and not fear making mistakes potentially. Also, are they able to, and this is quite difficult to observe as I've found out, but maintain kind of consistent performance standards despite setbacks, consistent decision making after errors? Can they show confidence when faced with challenge? Again, we could argue and discuss confidence and resilience, how they're related. The word composure came up, so that capacity to show composure under pressure. And then some more internal processes. So some participants said, we think observing a player using self-talk is a really good indicator of them demonstrating resilience under pressure, or being able to remain focused this idea of showing a positive attitude and composure again. So that was quite a big theme there, all around this idea of maintaining function under pressure.
I personally, from my experiences at the coalface, I think this is massive. I mean, this is a mental skill I personally label as intent, having an intent. And being, it's written in the piece here, approach rather than avoidance or avoiding challenge. We're approaching the challenge. It's, for me, I interpret this as the positive, proactive execution of actions rather than the hesitant and inhibited execution of actions. Now, I'm meshing my own sort of thoughts and philosophies and work here with what you're saying, but I think this is absolutely ginormous in the game. And whether we reflect as we're speaking now, the Euros football finished a month ago, and I think there are some very pertinent examples there of some of the best players in the world engaging in more of an avoidance mindset than an approach mindset. I think it's such a big topic, and I think it can even be a make or a break for some players, Ben. So it's interesting that you said that you found it difficult to this stuff difficult to observe, and maybe to disseminate from performance standards or confidence. Or can you speak a bit more to that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, difficult as having watched a lot of game footage. It's difficult to really kind of observe and separate some of these behaviours. We were quite conscious of, and I know there's been some criticisms in some of the behavioural literature around, some of these behaviours seem to be just normal performance behaviours. So, a player who is willing to take the ball under pressure and plays a forward pass and does so successfully, there's a strong argument that is a technical performance behaviour and not an indicator of resilience. So, we're quite conscious of that. In doing those observations, it's quite important, I think, that this has to be in response to a adversity or a stressor. It's interesting you mentioned, Dan, the word proactive as well earlier. Muzz is big on the proactive and reactive elements of resilience. I think possibly in this study we focused a lot on reaction or reactive to things that had happened. We identified it as a limitation in the paper, actually, that there's probably a lot going on proactively before the game's even started that might count as a resilient or resilience behaviour. Do you have anything to add there, Muzz?
Yeah, because it's interesting that you pick up proactive, because I literally picked up the same word that Dan mentioned there, and I think you're right, Dan. With this particular behaviour, I think, Ben, probably the majority of the other behaviours, let's say, for example, the rebound resilience behaviours, which we'll probably go on to talk about in a minute, a lot of these behaviours are reactive in relation to a player making a mistake, or a player under pressure, or in response to an error. But I do think these robust resilience behaviours, I do agree with Dan about these being potentially proactive, in the sense that these are skills or capabilities that players, or actions that players can proactively put in place beforehand, so that they've got plans and strategies before things start to become difficult or challenging. They've got a kind of a psychological, makeup, or a kind of a psychological routine, let's say, around self-talk, around how they remain focused. So for me, I can see where this is a little bit more proactive, because I often talk about resilience as not just reactive, but also proactive, putting plans and strategies in place before they become needed or become obvious. And I can definitely see these robust resilience behaviors as being more proactive than reactive in nature, for sure.
I mean, look, as a consultant, I'm always trying to draw upon the research literature. And, you're always trying to be evidence-based, evidence-informed, evidence-grounded, whichever one of those you like. And you're also mindful that you've got to be able to bring this alive for players, for coaches that you're working with. It's got to be practical. It's got to be delivered with a message that helps people to really embody what you're talking about. And I think I'm using proactive here in two ways, one of which is exactly what you're speaking to them, as that, that there is a mental playbook, if you like, that you've got prior to going in to perform. That lies at the heart of my consultancy practice. I would also suggest that when I think of this theme here that you've written, and I read through this section of your research, it's 3Ps that I'm thinking. This is very topical for me because I'm writing about this in my next book at the moment. And without going into too much detail, 3Ps are purposeful, positive, and proactive. Because for me, in my experience, I want players to consider purposeful, positive, and proactive being that energy towards rather than energy away from. It's approach rather than avoidance, towards rather than away from. So it's very much steeped, in evolutionary psychology. And when I think of proactive, I'm almost thinking of a player who is proactively mining for opportunities, is on the front for energy forward. So I think it's a fascinating area, and there's a real correlation to sort of my philosophical musings, if you like, and what you're going away and actually researching it and coming up with. So that's great for me. I'm pleased with that. I just do want to dwell just briefly on your ability to trap this data as accurately as possible, Ben, because I think it must be a challenge, because I'm picturing in my mind, let's say, a defender passing the ball into a midfielder. And I'm thinking of, there's two things going on. There's the technical action. There's possibly more things than two things going on, but there's the technical action, and then there's the approach or avoidance behavior, right? And just because that pass gets completed doesn't necessarily mean that technical action was absolutely spot on. It doesn't mean that they were in approach behavior. They may have been in avoidance behavior, but it didn't get completed. Or it might be that they were in approach behavior, but the technical action wasn't there. And so I'm exhausted just saying that. That's a minefield, Ben.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think this is where the complexity comes in. I think we sort of mentioned this is a nice start as a move towards being able to observe these indicators. Obviously, what we don't get from observing behaviour necessarily is intention, or we don't get an insight into what the player was thinking. So I think going forward, I think the real value in this type of work might be in, for example, engaging players in self-reflection, self-awareness. How have I responded in that particular situation? What was I thinking? What was I feeling? What might I do differently? What we're not necessarily getting towards here is a really sort of scientific measurement tool, I don't think, in terms of resilience, but something that in the practical world can be really useful in terms of educating coaches and analysts and to some extent scouts in terms of what these indicators we could look for, and therefore develop. And also, I think really powerfully in player self-awareness, self-reflection work, just being able to look back at clips and be more aware of how they react and respond under pressure. But completely agree, and we're seeing this now. It is difficult to separate some of these behaviours, and some of them are tied to technical actions, physical capabilities, and so on. So yeah, it's definitely complex.
Briefly coming to you, Muz, here, and thanks for that, Ben. And I think there's so much rich stuff there, and I would actually suggest this is great science, because it's providing people with a sense-making tool that has a mix of some real accuracy, some definitional accuracy, some models here that people can utilize. But at the same time, it's a sense-making tool that, where we know from, when you study human beings, there's always going to be some openness here, isn't there, Muz? We're not going to get absolutes like one does in physics or biology. What you're providing, as you've always provided in your work, Muz, is some sense-making tools with some accuracy of definitions and some models and from frameworks here that people can reflect on as they sense make and sense give within, their teams.
Yeah, very much so. And I think just bearing in mind, this is obviously the first stage of the research in terms of the program of work. So, on the back of this, as Ben mentioned earlier on, this particular piece was looking at understanding or exploring kind of perceptions from kind of football experts, so coaches, um, strength and conditioning, academy managers, heads of coaching, etc. Um, Whereas the second iteration of this is actually extending that to other sports psychology and resilience experts. So we kind of get a bit more of a consensus around what some of these behaviors are, to then ultimately developing a tool. And I think Ben sort of kind of alluded to this already so far, where he started to do some of this observation and realizing actually it doesn't, although this is what people are saying, actually in practice it's really really hard to actually observe that, on the ground in matches, etc. So yeah, I don't think at any stage we're going to get to a tool, as Ben said, where definitively we can kind of say, you know these are the behaviors, this is exactly how you kind of can observe them, but at least some sort of observational tool which is both scientifically grounded but also practical and usable by coaches and players.
Brilliant. And Ben, take us through this final form of resilience behaviour, the rebound resilience behaviours. Can you speak to me about rebound resilience?
Yeah, so this one probably ties into what a lot of people think of when they think about resilience. And certainly from the participants in this study, they spoke a lot about this capacity to bounce back, or maybe in the resilience literature, the capacity to rebound. So essentially, a relatively quick positive reaction or response to an error or a setback on the field. So a player an attacker who might have missed a chance or two will still put themselves in position to score subsequent to that. A player who very quickly is able to move on from an error. They spoke about the immediacy of a positive reaction. So misplaced pass or give the ball away immediately, they're into pressing to try and win the ball back. Again, you might notice potentially overlap to previous things we spoke about there. Or a player who, I think they gave an example of a winger who went down the outside, tried to put a cross in. It wasn't successful, but they're very quickly back into position. So all these things that show quite a quick positive response when something's not worked. I think one of the participants actually spoke about it would be interesting to actually use a timer to actually see how quickly do these players reinvest, with obviously the understanding that we spoke earlier about there has to be some processing time. Or you could even argue this, one of the really early things that I read prior to even starting this research was an anecdote from a talent scout who was working for a Premier League club. They said that most scouts will look for the 10 seconds post error or post setback for immediate reactions. But this person said, I'll track that player for 10, 15 minutes to actually look at, has there been a behaviour change? And that they said that was one of the key things they actually looked for. And they did label that resilience, which I found really interesting.
Very true. Just lifting some brief quotes from the piece here. Coach is talking about focused on the next thing, rolling it up and throwing it in the bin, importance of clearing the mind straight away, not dwelling on errors. We built these coping mechanisms into training. Lots of mini quotes here around what you're speaking to there, the rebound, and as you said, an extended quote. I wonder if you could almost do like a stopwatch, so that there's the monitoring of the recovery. Absolutely vital. And it's, for me, just briefly here, I think one of the things about this is when you read this stuff and you read about the simplicity of, just carry on, forget it, just next action. But the simplicity belies the difficulty of that, just because we just don't function that way as human beings. We go out onto the pitch, the course to play really, really well. And when our brain starts to notice, that's not gone so well in that moment there, and we start to feel that we're being judged and judging ourselves and so on and so forth. It's just there's a difference between simple and easy, isn't there, Ben? It's simple to talk about, but I'm sure you'd agree as a coach, it's not necessarily easy for your players to engage in that.
Yeah, completely agree. And just to add to the complexity, we obviously set out in this study to identify these behavioural indicators. What actually came through, we included these as supplementary materials, but a lot of the participants said, and they spoke about, when we talk about resilience and we look for it, it's often in those opposing behaviours. So sometimes it's easier to see a player who perhaps doesn't show these responses through body language, through a player who they spoke a lot about this idea of hiding. So they go missing within the game. They don't want to get back on the ball. So yes, we're looking for these behavioural responses in the positive sense, but equally, we might well be looking for the opposing, or the, if you want to call them, the more negative. I don't like using that term, but the more negative behavioural responses as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I found in my work actually discussing or helping someone become aware of their unhelpful behaviours, the hesitancy, the inhibition, actually opens up for the conversation for considering the kind of behaviours that they want to engage in. Hey, look, we're on to the last theme here. Learning focused resilience behaviours. Unpack this for us a little bit, Ben.
Yeah, I find this one quite interesting in that it seems different to the others, and I think from my understanding of resilience, it kind of it links to that quite nicely. So this idea of players showing a little bit of self-awareness or ownership on the field. So when things haven't gone to plan, are they able to adapt, be flexible, try different strategies to overcome these challenges? Are they good at kind of recognizing their mistakes and making obvious sort of corrective action rather than just kind of blindly continuing regardless? Are they willing to accept feedback? So will they engage with the coaches and accept and adapt? Will they kind of, even if things aren't going well, are they still kind of willing and able to kind of stick to the game plan? I think that's the word they used. Are they a player that takes responsibility? I remember a number of examples in the focus groups where they spoke up. We get players that just blame each other when things aren't going well. We want players that actually take responsibility on the field and are willing to try and change the situation.
I think this is an interesting one, unless I'm misunderstanding this. But I think this is interesting in as much as this is where there can be a real meshing between the mental and the technical tactical, or the tactical side of things, in as much as an in-game intelligence side of things, in as much as as I'll pose this as a question: could resilience be as a consequence of game knowledge and game intelligence? Because if you know a lot about the game and you do have an appropriate tactical response to what's going on, and that then allows you to behaviorally continue to engage in the game, is that in and of itself what you're talking to there, the capacity to carry on based on knowing about the game? Your learning makes a difference.
I think so. I think that did come up in conversation. This is potentially one of those subtle ones that, from a psychological point of view, might be difficult to observe, but maybe for this one, this is linked to technical actions to some extent.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think you make a really, really interesting point there, and it's probably one that I'll need to go away and think about, actually.
I mean, I think I'd hone in on what you said in terms of, is a person willing to engage in coach feedback in order to stay resilient? Is somebody able to continue to execute their technique to stay resilient? I think it interests me, because when you come to writing this stuff for an audience that wants practical ideas, it's does game knowledge, a player who has a great deal of game knowledge, is that is that knowledge something that's going to mediate somebody's resilience because they know a lot about the game? I think it's interesting. It almost comes under this banner for me, but I might be completely wrong there.
And Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, but ultimately within this research, but also the broader program of research, Dan, in terms of developing an observational tool that coaches, players, for example, can use in practice. I guess part of it is we do want this to be integrated as part of the technical and tactical discussion.
Yeah.
We just think that this is, and I know, Dan, you're very big on this, is creating an environment that is psychologically informed. And I think part of this tool is helping coaches to think in a more psychological way, but integrating that as part of the technical and tactical. Correct me if I'm wrong with that, Ben, but that's my thought process, I guess, with this research, is that we're certainly not suggesting that it's separate. I think actually we want to think about how can we see some of these behaviors in the context of technical, physical, tactical kind of work.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've spoken about, I think, within these academy contexts, we want this common understanding amongst a range of staff who are involved in player development, player observation. So spoken to quite a lot of analysts actually who are so used to observing for your typical game outcomes or technical, tactical stuff, but to be able to integrate these psychological behaviours as well alongside the coach and staff, I think is potentially really useful.
I like it because it helps somebody broaden their lens of what they're seeing, and deepen as well. I always use a model where I think of the technical, tactical, and physical components of sport being underpinned by the biopsychosocial component, and that biopsychosocial component is always happening and it's always mediating. And I think the models that you're creating are important because it helps the coach and the player to consider the lens of what they're experiencing or what they're seeing from a behavioural standpoint as more than just that. It's the biopsychosocial constantly interacting with technical, tactical, physical. Gents, absolutely fascinating. Let's close things out by considering what's next. Ben, what's next for you? Where is this going? It sounds like this was done a little bit of time ago, and you've got more papers coming out. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this was, I mean, the study in itself was over a kind of 18-month period, so it was a big piece of work. It did take place some time ago. We've as we touched on, we've since taken the findings from this and done a subsequent study where I've actually been able to refine. I mean, if we were to present a list of 40 behaviours to a practitioner to go away and observe these, they would probably have some questions to ask. So we've refined these down actually to based on the expertise or the input from experts from a range of different areas to a set of, at this stage, 10 behaviours which we think represent resilience really quite nicely. We're in the stage at the minute of looking to develop the observational tool. So we are doing a lot of match observation. We're working with academies, with their coaching, analysis, psychology staff, to essentially look at, can we reliably observe these behaviours between different observers across different contexts. We're using the sort of traditional methods around observational tool development there, where you go through a series of different kind of validity and reliability phases. And once we've got to a tool that we feel is robust and reliable, we're then looking to go into some academy clubs and actually go a bit deeper. So can we look over a period of time, over the course of a season, can we really drill down on these individuals, how they react and respond to the stresses that they will inevitably come across? And can we work with the coaching staff to support players in developing those behavioural responses? So a bit more of a longitudinal study, but hopefully looking to apply these findings in the real world context.
Fantastic. Well, that sounds like there's a part 2 coming up on the Sports Psych Show with both of you. So really excited to get you back on. But let's close things now. Ben, let's come to you first. How can people find you, follow you, and get in touch?
So I am on all the conventional social media platforms. Twitter, Ashdown, at Ashdown Ben is my handle, I believe, and I use LinkedIn. But if anyone wants to email, more than happy to provide my email address, or equally, I've got my staff page at the university website. It would actually be great to get, I'm always looking for sort of feedback on this from people that are in the game or in research. So really would be keen to have conversations, and if there are potentially clubs that are interested in the research, would be more than happy to talk to them about it as well.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Ben. And Muz, how can people find you, follow you, and get in contact?
Yeah, similar to Ben. So on Twitter at Mus, M-U-S, and Sarkar, S-A-R-K-A-R, on LinkedIn as well. In terms of research, do just check out ResearchGate, because that's what a lot of the times where academics are able to put kind of research, because often researchers tend to be behind a bit of a paywall. So ResearchGate is a good platform to kind of get access to the research. But similar to Ben, yeah, if people want to know a little bit more information about the research, but also see if they can be involved in some of the subsequent research that Ben is leading, then please feel free to drop either of us an email as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, gents. Really generous with your time today, so thank you so much for that.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via X or Facebook, or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.